welcome to Southbound Podcast. We have guest speaker today, Mr. John Bauknight. John currently serves as a senior associate with NAI Earle Furman in the Spartanburg office. He's also president of Longleaf Holdings company, which pretty much has several companies that you guys are invested in and oversee. John also has been a minority investor with some local companies, one of which I'm sure everybody will be familiar with, Southern Tide, and also is the owner of R.J. Rocker's Brewing Company in Spartanburg, South Carolina. John recently has been very engaged and continues to be engaged with the Spartanburg community with the recent startup of the Spartanburg Angel Network. So we welcome you, John. Glad to have you here today and look forward to learning about you and kind of some of the successes and kind of what makes John Bauknight tick. So maybe we'll start off by just kind of maybe giving us a little bit about your background. Where'd you grow up? How'd you make Spartanburg your home for like going on 36 years?
Sure. And first, Peyton, thank you and Patrick for having me on to Southbound. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I was born in Ohio a long time ago and then moved to the mountains of North Carolina, the Highlands, when I was young in 1976. Went to boarding school in Virginia and then found my way to Wofford College in 1985. So I've been in Spartanburg for 36 years now and was fortunate enough to marry a Converse gal, Laura Chappell at the time, who I've been married to for 32 years. And Spartanburg's been a great place for us to raise our family and also be very successful in the business environment.
Yeah, you have two children, Ellis and Chappell. Their ages.
Yes, Ellis is 27, a school teacher at Rudolph Gordon here in Greenville, which we're real proud of. And then Chappell's 24 and working in the natural resources world down in Charleston, South Carolina.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to dive right in. When we think back kind of as you moved through college and you came into the working world, maybe talk a little bit about one of your first job experiences and kind of what things did you learn early on? How were you successful? What were you great at? What did you not like? Those types of things. You give us a little insight on your first job.
Sure. So my first job was probably one that I learned more from than anything I've done. And it didn't last very long. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but it was something where from a learning standpoint, sales has been my deal my whole life. And it's what I enjoy. No matter what business I've been involved in, it's always been on the sales and marketing side where I kind of succeed. And I went to work for a company called Premier Industries out of Ohio, actually, when I was first out of Wofford. And I went through about a week's training program and orientation on sales skills. And I learned very early on what you didn't want to have to do in the world of sales. And it's easier said as a 54-year-old now than it was as a 22-year-old at the time. But, I learned the power of cold calling versus the referral network. And I know we'll talk a lot about, why folks are successful in sales and various businesses, but the power of networking is really everything. And I learned early on I wanted to network and meet people and not have to pick up the phone and cold call.
Yeah, I recall you telling us a little bit about those experiences and how you were successful but there was always this spirit that was driving you when anything you did, but particularly maybe early on, and that's that an entrepreneurial spirit. So maybe if you can tell a little bit of how you navigated from that first job and then made that decision, hey, let's maybe take a different approach, let's take a different path.
Yeah, sure. And if we step back, when I was a sophomore at Wofford, I actually started my first legitimate business with my now business partner, Andrew Babb, and great friend. And we started a video documentation company where we'd go in and record the belongings of folks' homes in case there was a natural disaster. And folks kind of thought that was a crazy idea until we had a very good friend who's a mutual friend of ours that lost pretty much their entire home down at Pauley's and said, what in the world are we going to do to his wife? And she said, you can go to the safety deposit box and grab the tape that John and Andrew did for you and give it to the insurance company. And that was our first step. And then ironically, our equipment got stolen and guess what? We didn't have insurance. So we were out of business. And that was a learning lesson in and of itself. But, from that moment on and really going forward to answer your question, I always had a drive to do something on my own. It's something that I think is innate in folks. I don't think it's something that you wake up one day and just say, I want to be an entrepreneur. I think it's in there and, it comes out of you and you're ready to hit the walls, charging. So I left Premier after just a couple of months and was fortunate enough to go to work with Tommy Young at Young Office Environments for about a year to get my feet under me in Spartanburg. And from that point forward, I got into the insurance world and started my first business in, I guess, the early 1990s.
Yeah. So in that first business, it's all of the the decisions that have to be made and some of the things you have to make on your own. Obviously, sometimes challenges come your way, and to me, it seems like all success stories at some point in time, if you go back deep, you kind of find sometimes where, well, there's some challenges there that it's not all green. It's not all just rose and or what is it, gravy that you would say. But can you talk a little bit about that desire of owning your own company, and then once you made that decision to own your own company, kind of some of the challenges you maybe had to successfully navigate?
Yeah, I mean, early on, the business that was in the insurance world that I started back in the mid 90s with a partner is where I learned a lot about kind of life lessons, right? And I think you've heard me use the phrase before, but fantastic failures. And it was a wonderful business opportunity that I had, but unfortunately from a people standpoint and a culture standpoint, I ran into a wall. And, I found myself with about a 6-month-old daughter in maybe January of 95 with a notice on my desk that said I was no longer with the company that I owned 50% of. And it was a little bit of a gut check. It was certainly a shock. And, but as I look back on it, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me because I learned a lot about how you treat people and how you don't treat people. And, the way my life has gone since then would have been a lot different had I stayed in that relationship. And
speaking of relationships, at that time you reached out to some folks just to kind of talk about what there were options. There were options out there, and I think that's kind of when you landed another position in the insurance business. But,
yes.
Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, well, once I mopped myself off the floor and went to the unemployment line, which the attorneys had encouraged me to do, which was a humbling experience. I was standing across the counter from a gal that I graduated Wofford with in '89, and that was a little bit of humble pie there, but it was what I had to do to take care of the family. But I knew the insurance industry from a couple of years of doing that, and was fortunate to get hired on by a company called Health Source, who was one of the first HMOs that had moved into South Carolina. And then I just was really fortunate to inherit a good book of business to work. And I ended up selling the largest account that the company had sold in the northeastern through the eastern United States that they operated in, enrolled about 10,000 folks into the HMO and got a nice commission check, and walked into my boss's office about a week later and told him I was out of there and going to go start a real estate development business.
Again, I think that it tells a lot about your entrepreneurial spirit rearing its head again. Successful, very successful, very secure position. But let's go find out what really makes John tick and try to move into something else. So you moved into this real estate firm, and that was kind of one of your first real estate ventures.
Yes.
You kind of pulled that together, and as I recall, you were doing some kind of residential projects. You were kind of, things were growing, but then 2008 hit, and so another challenge went your way.
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, we had all the ideas. We thought Spartanburg was poised to grow. That was back in 95, 96 that we started the little firm that was known as Brown and Bauknight. And, we had great visions, but no money really to do it. I had my big check that I'd gotten that, had to also support a family and put a roof over the head. But, it enabled me to also learn more about, the real estate world, and something that's continued to be obviously a huge part of my life and what I do for a living, now. But, the door then that from an entrepreneurial standpoint that opened was when we didn't see it working was just reading a happenstance article about a little shredding franchise called Shred It, who's not a little franchise anymore. They're the largest in the world. And, ended up getting in the shredding business in 1997 with my brother-in-law, Nick Wildrick. And, just had an incredible ride with that business.
I think that's a super interesting part about, you had read that article, and then I think you reached out to to a colleague or to someone that you knew was in the industry because you were looking to franchise, didn't know whether you wanted to franchise? Let's say, no, let's talk to someone. You spoke to somebody that kind of gave you some ins and outs about it.
Yeah, a gentleman named John and Cherie Bartell up in Pittsburgh, who were friends for a long while. John since passed away, but Cherie's still active in the business. And they said, you guys are too good to be franchise owners. And, it's also interesting how things happen. Had we bought the franchise, we'd have been in the upstate of South Carolina, and I'm not sure where else we would have been, but instead we took it and did our own thing. And next thing we knew, we're an Inc. 500 company twice, which was, a big deal back in the day when, growth rates in the .com were, off the charts. And we hit, I think, the Inc. 500 the first time in 2003 at number 92, which was pretty cool. It was a goal that we'd set for ourselves. And I think, as you obviously know the story, we had an opportunity to exit that business. Cintas bought our business in 2006 and ironically sold the business to Shred It, which is where we almost started the whole dance.
Right,
so
right.
Interesting how life comes full circle sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think as you talked about, kind of, again, another decision, you got some advice, you reached out to folks to talk about that. And that funny quick story of your YPO guys, that when you talk to them and trying to to get a little advice on whether to sell it, you just didn't know whether to sell it or not.
Yeah, it was, people kept asking us what we were going to do, And I mean, we'll talk about it, I know, in a little bit, as far as what our company was all about and what our values and kind of culture were. But the sale opportunity was one we really hadn't thought of. And then once we got the press a pretty good bit for a couple of years at the national shows, I was chair of the National Association for a while. We said, what do we want to do, when we grow up? And we sat down and kind of developed more of a business plan. And I had joined YPO in 2005 and then started with a forum group that I'm still active with to this day. That's a great sounding board for me as an individual, for my family, for my business. And, when I pitched the idea of selling, they thought I'd lost my mind because we just had a meeting in Spartanburg and they just thought we had the greatest thing going. Culture was great. And, when I flipped the number on the table, they said, sell, sell, sell. So,
and I guess that kind of is a great segue to you listening to folks and paying attention to mentors. And I think that as you look back, kind of your endeavors early on and your kind of mid-career endeavors, as well as kind of where you are today, I think mentors and folks that you could rely on and talk to and trust, I think have been a big part of the reasons why you feel like you've been successful as well. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first person I called when I lost my job with the insurance partner was my Uncle Clarence, who lives here in Greenville, South Carolina, and is one of the great entrepreneurs of South Carolina. Back in the day, had one of the top privately held businesses in South Carolina called Builder Mart of America that spawned off a multitude of different businesses. And, really is somebody that I've always leaned on, for advice and kind of structure in my life. And he's the go-to guy from a family standpoint. I certainly love my dad, but my dad is very not an entrepreneur, which is fine. And like I said earlier, you either are or you're not. And it's all good. But Clarence has been special to me. And then, in Spartanburg, I've developed a great relationship over my time there with George Dean Johnson, who's been very good to me and is always an ear that's there if I need some time. And then Bill Barnett is also one that I consider to be a mentor that I can call on at any point in time, to get some advice on what's going on in town or business-wise, or where he thinks I need to be from a personal standpoint as far as involvement in the community. It's been good. And then the third person that's kind of business-related, I guess, would be Bill Timmerman, who was the CEO of SCAN at the time. I went through the Liberty Fellows program, 2008 through 10. And Bill's somebody that I still keep in touch with a little bit. It was a great sounding board for me back. You talked about 2008 earlier. It was a tough time that we went through starting in 2008, no matter what you were doing. And Bill was somebody that was really good for me to make sure that I stayed grounded as we kind of plowed through some pretty big business decisions back in that 2008 through, 10, 11, 12 period.
Sure. The as you think about the different stages of your career, and I think about this entrepreneurial spirit that you've built upon, what do you think is some of probably the best advice you might have gotten from these mentors? I mean, I know that they are all successful in their own right, but there's probably a kind of a common theme.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit, Peyton, the culture thing and the values piece of it that we'll talk about, I think, at different stages of the conversation is what, folks have really leaned on me. An example of that is that we were looking at being involved in rolling up the shredding industry around the country. And naturally, George Dean was someone that I talked to about that very seriously because of his success back at that time with Blockbuster and then ultimately with Extended Stay and Advance America. I mean, just obviously an incredibly successful person from that regard. But, we learned very early on in those conversations that we didn't want to be the guys jumping on a plane on Sunday night and coming back to our families on Thursday or Friday. And, it gets back to kind of the, what's the culture that you're looking for? Not that what they're doing or anyone's doing wrong that's getting on that plane on Sunday and coming back on Friday, but it's not what we wanted, for ourselves and for our families. So that was great to be able to talk through that with somebody like George, because we had a really good opportunity in front of us. We had the private equity money lined up and we were going to run a huge part of the country, but we just decided it wasn't us. It wasn't what we wanted.
That's super. I remember you telling me that he told you it wasn't about the money, it's about the lifestyle.
That's right.
So that fits real well with how you want to, and that also to me, it kind of, that afforded you to really be present, certainly for your children as they were growing up, but certainly to engage in the community and other organizations and charitable organizations as well. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. You've got a long list of board appointments and chairs, but maybe talk a little bit about the importance of community involvement, what that does from a business perspective, what it does from a personal perspective.
Sure. I mean, that's, I think it's important that we all give back, right? I mean, that's one of the things. But I started working in the Spartanburg community very early on, actually, while I was a psychology major at Wofford. I had a sister who was a Downs child, so I was very involved in the mentally handicapped side, so got involved in the Charles Lee Center and ultimately ended up chairing the foundation board for a number of years and have lifelong friends there. And then you mentioned Rockers earlier. I got to know Mark Johnson, who founded Rockers, because we served on the board together. So, we always encouraged our employees to be involved in the community and do something that you're passionate about and that you like, right? So pick something that you really enjoy. And then, the backside of that is that business relationships happen, right? I mean, you get involved and it's the networking that I talked about earlier. I mean, you can sit there and dial, phone numbers, cold calling all day long. But, if you're sitting in a boardroom with 20 folks, the networking piece of it's, huge. So it's something that certainly gives back to you, and it's not why you're doing it, but it's a bonus certainly of doing it. So I've stayed very involved in the community. And as you know, and Harper Corporation was a great partner in the Center of Philanthropy that we just built for the Spartanburg County Foundation. I spent 7 years there, just retired as a trustee after 7 years. And, that's a monument to Rob Chapman, who's a dear friend of the communities that, I smile every time I go by, that is a great success that'll have a huge impact on our community for all the other nonprofits and folks that need a place to convene. So it's fun to see how your efforts, don't go away when you step off the board. You see the work of art or whatever it may be after the fact.
Sure, and I certainly encourage our listeners to go by and take a look at that facility. It's really a wonderful facility for the community. Networking is such a powerful term in our business development world, for gaining new relationships, for learning about new opportunities. Pulling away from the kind of the day-to-day grind in the office in the business world, let's talk a little bit about some hobbies and how they might drive you. Kind of some of your favorite hobbies and kind of how do they inspire you?
Sure. So it really, I think of two things when I think of hobbies, and one is kind of hobby for self, which I just got back from a great trip to Montana, spent a couple of days on the river, and that's just a very peaceful opportunity. generally speaking, the cell phones don't work. You don't want to have a cell phone. And it's a great opportunity for me to kind of recharge and also get the mind kind of going and thinking, and kind of, really to spend self-time, which is really important, that we all, do that. So, that is one. And then the other that I've really, enjoyed from a business perspective and personally is golf. I'm a big golfer, and I've done a lot of business on the golf course. It's a great way to obviously entertain folks that are either customers or folks that are maybe prospects that you're talking to, or just going out with the guys and having a fun time. I mean, I've been fortunate to have gone all over the planet playing golf. Just got back from Scotland with a group about 2 years ago, and going to Ireland next summer. And it's just it's a lifelong sport that also has a great business perspective from a networking standpoint.
Well, fantastic. Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to maybe dive in a little deeper on some of the ways that you feel that you can build strong, long-lasting relationships. We might get a story or two from some of your unique businesses that you're involved with or have been involved with. So we'll be right back.
Great.
The Southbound Podcast is sponsored by Blue Water Civil Design. Blue Water Civil Design is a professional civil engineering firm located in Greenville, South Carolina, serving the southeastern United States and beyond. Started in 2010, the firm is bound together by 4 founding professional engineers with more than 100 years combined experience in all aspects of civil site work engineering, land planning, site selection, and analysis. For more information, please visit us at bluewatercivil.com.
We're back live here with Southbound Podcast with our guest speaker, John Bauknight, Senior Associate with NAI Furman out of Spartanburg, South Carolina. John, we've been talking about the importance of relationships and how it's so important to build those relationships that are long-lasting and strong. And you talked about hobbies and community involvement. You certainly have been very involved with the community. But let's talk a little bit about taking those relationships and maybe some of the aspects that you kind of have in your philosophy that kind of led you to, looking at local companies, local interests, and diving into owning some of these companies as well.
Sure. So, we talked earlier about Southern Tide, and I'll touch on, how we got there is part of the relationship building and the networking that goes on. So we talked about my uncle being a great mentor of mine, and one of his division presidents of Enterprise Computer Systems, which was part of Builder Mart of America, was Jim Twining. And Jim and Clarence sold that business back around the time I sold my shredding business. So Jim and I got to know each other actually through YPO. Jim was aging out of YPO when I was kind of coming along, and we developed a relationship, and we were actually looking for a business to buy together. For Jim to run. And it led to a conversation about Alan Stevens and his mother that had this crazy shirt idea. Alan was a senior, I think, at South Carolina at the time, back in 2008. And Jim said, I've been serving as an advisor to this young man, and I think this business has got legs. And we looked at the slide deck on it, and when I look at different business opportunities, and we talked about the Angel Network we've got going on in Spartanburg now, they all, for me, go back to really looking at 3 kind of key things. And that's, it starts with the people that are involved in the business. I just don't think you can have a successful business, without having good people. I like to say that you can have the best racehorse on the planet and put an okay jockey on it, you're not going to go anywhere. But you can take an okay horse and put a great jockey on it, you're going to win races. So the people side of it's really important to me, and that's really the number one, check the box. And I have had the fantastic failures that we talked about earlier a little bit because of being wrong about people. But generally speaking, I think I'm pretty good at reading people. And then the second thing is the marketplace. So what's the market look like? And if you rewind the clock back to 2008 and you looked at high-end apparel, Peter Millar was a name that was growing by leaps and bounds. But other than that, it's what we all grew up with, which was Izod and Polo. And that was really about it. And now if you look out there are a gazillion other lines that have come along, but we hit the marketplace right. And then that leads to the third thing, and that's the ability to scale the business. And that's where Jim's experience who knew nothing about the apparel world, but was great at sales and marketing, which is also, my strength, was putting together the best marketing plan that you could. And then, 5 years into it, we had an opportunity to sell that business to a private equity firm and made all of the investors happy. So it still makes me smile every time I see the shirts, and I still buy them. So.
That's right. It is a great brand, and it's certainly a pride thing here to have a brand that's made here, or founded here.
Yeah, the offices are right around the corner.
Right around the corner. Yeah, exactly. Stories from some of your businesses. I'm sure you have a bunch of them, but interesting stories of, game-changing moments. Anything out there that comes to mind about that?
Yeah, I think about business startups in general, and I mean, the rule of thumb I've also used there, whether I'm starting the business or investing in it, is that it's usually a 3 to 5 year learning curve. I mean, you're not going to jump right in unless you get lucky, which, if you go back to the time when I was selling insurance and enrolled 10,000 folks in a plan, that was luck. I hit it a lot quicker than the normal curve on a sales cycle. But generally speaking, 3 to 5 years is where I think you know that you're going to either make it or not. And I remember sitting in the warehouse on Blackstock Road, in a warehouse that ironically George Dean, before I knew him very well, owned, with my feet up on the desk, and a fraternity brother called and said, "You need to come out to BMG Music out on Highway 290 in Duncan and talk to them about crushing CDs." And I kind of puffed up a little bit and said, I'm in the paper shredding business. What do I know about CDs? And we were about 14 months into that business, and my wife was poking me in the ribs a little bit of, if this doesn't work in the next month or two, you're going to have to go get a job. I was like, I really don't want to have to go get a job. I want to be an entrepreneur. And we went out and talked to BMG Music, and our whole business model changed. It was really a wild ride that, we rode through the CDs and DVDs and computer software world. And, it's one that doesn't even exist now. Everything's downloaded, at this point in time. But for about 5, 6, 7 years, we had an incredible run from the late 90s till we sold the business in 2006, and then even keeping part of that business, thereafter. But we were on the hinges of maybe failing, not because we weren't trying hard, but you never know what the business model is going to do. And that's the other piece that's important, is that sometimes you have to adapt to the environment. We're experiencing the same thing a little bit right now in the brewing industry, as far as having to change the model because of all the competition that we now have.
So let's talk about RJ Rockers. That's a really interesting story. Fantastic beer, by the way.
Thank you.
I do recall the late Stout that was there. I remember some great stories that and being involved with sharing a beer with you there in the plant. I had the great honor of building that facility and project managing that facility for you. So enjoy going back every time we go. But give us a little RJ Rockers backstory.
Yeah, it's been an interesting story. So I talked about the Charles Lee Center earlier, and Mark Johnson, who founded the brewery in '97, which makes us one of the oldest in South Carolina. We're getting ready to have our 25th celebration this next April, which is pretty cool. And Mark and I met. Mark was in the brew pub business, got into the brewery business, which in South Carolina at the time you could do one or the other, but not both. And he came to me when we bought our first property in downtown Spartanburg, was the 100 East Main building, the old Palmetto Belk building, and said, I want to get back into the restaurant business. And I told him I thought he'd lost his mind, which is kind of funny because now I'm in the restaurant business. But I asked him what the needs were, and he said, I just don't have the capital to grow this business. And Nick and I studied the craft market. And back in 2007, there were only 5 craft breweries in South Carolina. Wasn't a huge national scene, but we kind of felt like it was one that was getting ready to take off. And, it took off. I mean, we bought a majority of the business in 2007. And then also another project that you were involved in, ironically, on both sides is that we had bought a piece of property out on Highway 295 that adjoined our shredding and record storage facilities. And we're going to move the brewery out there. And lo and behold, George Dean called and said, you need to put the brewery downtown. We're getting ready to put the fuel on the fire here and get this downtown redevelopment going. And I said, Mr. Johnson, we just bought a building. We're getting ready to start like in the next week. I've got equipment coming from China. And he said, come see me. And I said, yes, sir. And he shot a term sheet down on the table that was kind of hard to pass on. He gave me the building for taxes and insurance for 2 years, or buy it for the $1 million he had paid for it. And it's pretty wild as we have moved forward, and I've gotten more involved in the real estate development part of part of Spartanburg, to see that the impact that's had on downtown Spartanburg, because it's a bit of a bookend to the redevelopment we're experiencing right now. But it's been a fun business to be involved in. I mentioned earlier, the business model's changed. I got real involved in the startup of the first guild that we had statewide back in 2010, and started getting after changing the laws, because back in 2010, you couldn't go have a pint of beer in my brewery unless you were with me and the lights were off. So we formed the guild. 2010-ish, we got the first law passed, I think, in 2011, that gave us the ability to sell 16 ounces of beer to the public. And then 2 years later, we got it expanded to 48 ounces. And then we had what is now known as the Stone Bill. Stone Brewing from San Diego, California, who's a great, great brand, really was interested in South Carolina. And our laws at the time didn't allow them to be in the food and beverage business. And it was a real wake-up call for the state, which was a great thing. We got Bobby Hitt and the Department of Commerce behind it, which was great. And unfortunately, we didn't land Stone. But as we sit here today, we've gone from the 5 breweries that were in South Carolina back in the 2007 period to now well over 100. So it makes me, very proud to be in towns like Greenville or Spartanburg or Charleston or Columbia or wherever it may be, and you drink local, and it's really a neat thing. But it's made us shift our business model from a wide distribution channel to focusing on the restaurant piece that I thought I never wanted to be in.
That's just, I tell you, those are incredible stories, and they mean so much to our listeners, because that certainly is certainly a local, what we feel is a local brand of brew, to craft brew to enjoy. So thinking about the future, thinking about all the things that are going on in our region, certainly locally, looking at where we're located geographically. Tell us a little bit about kind of your perception of the future, some of the trends, what you think are kind of some things you're concerned about, and maybe some things that you're pretty excited about.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I guess to look to the future, you also think a little bit about the past, right? So I've been in Spartanburg since 1985, in the upstate. I've been in and around since I was young, with my uncle still having a home here. And it's unbelievable to see what's happened. I mean, if you look back, I remember hearing probably 25, 30 years ago, I think, about the time I'd gotten out of school, that, the corridor between the Raleigh-Durham area and Atlanta was going to be, the quickest growing corridor in the country. And, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out we're right in the middle of that. So it said, wow, well, we got an opportunity here. And it's been awesome to watch what's happened in the entire upstate. I mean, Greenville certainly has been on the forefront of it, and Spartanburg's coming on really strong right now. So I'm really proud to call it home. I think, like me, you probably couldn't get out of Spartanburg quick enough when you were younger. Didn't probably think you'd come back and work in the area, because there wasn't a lot to be had. It was an old textile town. And, now it's a place that, we're starting to see your kids, my kids, and our friends' kids want to come back and live, which really is, I think, when we know we've succeeded. So I think that, we've hit a great stride where we are right now, but I think the future is even brighter. I mean, we've got, from a development standpoint, more going on right now in and around downtown Spartanburg and downtown Greenville and the greater, metro area than we've all ever experienced. I mean, it's a great time to be in the commercial real estate business. We're getting calls from all over the country from people that want to be doing business in our markets, and that's when you've made it. It's not just the folks in the community doing projects that are the same people we've all known for a long time that have done great things, but it's folks from Charlotte, folks from New York that we're dealing with right now. It's the whole mix. So I think it's just an incredible time to be where we are, and I think the future is just, great. I think we've got the infrastructure, and then also the people that are willing to make things happen to keep the train going. In that train moving forward, what are some of those things we certainly, both as leaders, as government leaders, as private investors, private industry, what do we need to be paying attention to? What do we want to make sure that we're taking care of, kind of in our climate? Yeah, and I think you also maybe said earlier, what might could be an obstacle for us.
Right.
And, it was interesting. I was talking to a client this morning from Charleston that's done a great project in Spartanburg, and we were talking about all the accolades that we're getting in Spartanburg right now. And he said, don't make the mistake that Charleston made. And we talked a little bit more about that. And I think, part of the answer to your question is the infrastructure, right? Is to make sure that we take care of, workforce housing. And if you go to Bill Barnett, who we've talked about a little bit as being a great mentor and friend, I mean, what he's doing with the North Side community in Spartanburg is really incredible, because if we're going to grow with the 1,600 plus units that we've got coming online, either as we speak or in the planning stages, and have the buildup of population in our town, we've got to have the ability for the workers to have great affordable housing, that's nearby. And in the case of Charleston, not to poke an eye at Charleston, but they've pushed them well off the peninsula, if you will, and it's made it very difficult for restaurants and folks to recruit workers. So I think we've got to keep our eye on the ball, from an infrastructure standpoint.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I want to touch back a little bit on community involvement. I think this could be answered certainly high level, but I feel like that kind of company investments, community involvement, there has to be kind of the center core of some of the reasons and decisions you would actually invest or participate. So maybe some advice to our listeners out there, young and well seasoned. What would you think to offer some advice on how they can be successful in their careers?
Yeah, so we've talked about a lot of great things, and as I look at, what I look at when I invest in businesses, and then look at the different businesses I've been involved in, a lot of it goes back to the Shred First days when we kept having people say, "What are you guys going to do when you grow up?" And we just said, "We don't know." We sat down with our team back, and this is probably in 2000, 2001-ish kind of time frame, and said, who are we? And let us define who we are, and then hopefully that'll define who we want to be. And we sat down with our management team of 5 or 6 folks at that time and went through an exercise to basically define our values. And it's still something that's used with all the different businesses that I'm involved in now. The acronym is CRISP, CRISP, with an extra P on the end. And the first part of it is culture. So when I talk to young folks or folks that are making career transitions in jobs that have been doing one thing for a while and thinking about doing something different, what's the culture that you want to be involved in? I mean, that's really, to me, the most important thing as I look at, where I want to work or the associates that I want to have. I mean, do we have the culture that, you really want to be around? I'm not a coat and tie guy. I dressed up for you today.
You're looking good, John.
Thank you.
But you always look good.
But, culture is huge. And then, the next is reputation. And we always said for reputation, it's what other people think about you, not what you think about yourself. Because, what I think about myself versus what other people think about me or my business can be 2 totally different things. So, we really focused on doing employee satisfaction surveys and things of that nature to make sure that we had a good reputation in the marketplace. And I think we certainly accomplished that with Shred First back in the day, because I was chair of the national board and, very involved. So, reputation is there. The I is integrity, and we simply there said there's no question. If you don't have integrity in business, then I don't want to do business with you. And I've walked away from business opportunities because of, the feeling of not dealing with somebody I want to deal with. And, we just simply on the tagline on the old website said no question on that. And then the S is service, right? Nothing that any of us do is successful without service. And we like to tell all of the associates that work with us that everybody's in the service business. It doesn't matter whether you're working on the shred machine or driving the truck or in customer service or selling or whatever you're doing. We all are there to service the customer. And if you make the customer happy, they're going to take care of, I said that backwards. If you make the employee happy, they're going to take care of the customer, is the other piece that we always used to say about that from a service standpoint. And then the first P is passion. That's, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, is a huge word for me. If you're not passionate about what you do, I talk to a lot of the college students that I speak with that are getting ready to graduate from Wofford or Clemson or South Carolina or wherever it may be that I'm speaking to. you want to be passionate about what you do. I mean, it goes back to, some of the philanthropic work that we talked about earlier that I've been involved in is I want to be involved in things that I care about and I'm passionate about. So, that's key. And then the last is my favorite word for the entrepreneurial world, and that's persistence. And if you don't have the ability to be persistent, you're not going to succeed. And that also gets back to that very first sales class that I went through, where I learned I could make 20 cold calls to get maybe 1 or 2 appointments to maybe make a sale, or I could get 20 referrals from my buddy Peyton and get probably 3 to 5 appointments from folks and make a sale or 2, or I can get that personal referral where you actually pick up the phone and call Patrick for me and say, hey man, would you talk to my buddy John? And it takes about 10 of those to get the same numbers. So the persistence piece of it is huge. Stay after it.
Absolutely.
And as the great late Jim Valvano said, I just completely forgot what he said.
That's all right.
And never give up. Yeah, it's at the bottom of my slide.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, John, we certainly appreciate having you on Southbound today, and we know that you're going to continue to do great things for this community, this regional community, and certainly the business world. So thanks for being on today, and we look forward to what's to come.
I appreciate it. It's been fun.
All right.
I've enjoyed a bunch.
Thank you, John.